thank you, Mayoral candidate Lightfoot, for being with us today. We appreciate that you filled out our candidate questionnaire,
Sure.
you attended our forum, and we're really excited that you're coming back to talk to us about how if you became mayor of Chicago, you'll be a civil liberties champion. So we wanted to focus on 3 areas today:
Okay.
policing, surveillance, and if we have time, license suspensions.
Sure.
So in our candidate questionnaire, we asked if there were any elements of the consent decree that you would want to change and what changes you would make. You shared your public safety plan, and you highlighted some of your recommendations for reforming CPD. Those included implementing civilian oversight of CPD, training officers on interacting with youth, implementing a co-responder system in which mental health professionals work with OEMC and CPD to link individuals to community-based treatment options, expanding efforts to diversify CPD, including hiring a chief diversity officer. Those sound like really great policy ideas, but how would you actually implement those recommendations?
Well, first of all, I think we could easily do most of these things. We can, first of all, let's talk about the chief diversity officer. That's easy. We just put that into the budget and hire and empower that person. I think in many, with the city generally, but also with CPD, it's important that somebody is looking at policies and practices through a racial and ethnic equity lens. And we don't have that right now in CPD, and I think it's critically important. To be blunt, race matters in policing. We live in a very diverse city, but we also live in a very segregated city, and making sure that our officers understand the diversity and nuance and why that is important for them to have as another tool in discharging their daily responsibilities, I think is really important. The chief diversity officer should inform a lot of what's doing, from recruiting to training to retention of officers, and also clearly be involved in the ongoing work of building bridges between the police and communities that they are sworn to serve and protect. If we look to other cities, for example, Oakland, I believe, has a co-responder policy and practice that's been in effect for quite some time. So we can borrow the best practices from those cities and implement them here, and hopefully do a much more effective job of saving lives. And really, we need to think more broadly about how we re-stitch together the mental health and trauma safety net. So it's not just when the police department, there was a lot of devastation that was done with the closing of the clinics, but the truth is those clinics had a very narrow focus and weren't really able to serve a broad array of folks. So I know there's a big push to open up the clinics, but I think the issue about having a mental health safety net is much broader than that, particularly given the fact that so many people, including our young people, are really suffering from a wide variety of trauma and PTSD that manifests itself in lots of different ways.
But a lot of the issues with CPD rely on a shift in culture, so culture change is really important.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
How would you go about, or your administration go about, shifting culture, which is a huge task? In
my experience with CPD and other police departments, the culture really lies at the sergeant level. And the reason I say that is sergeants touch on a daily basis more individual officers than any other supervisor in the chain of command. So getting the sergeant position right, I think, is critically important to make sure that all the things that we're trying to do in terms of transformation of the department actually have resonance and are executed through the sergeants. So that means we've got to rethink the sergeant's test. I believe the sergeant's test is a couple decades old. We need to also think about, well, what's the job description of the sergeant in the current framework, where we need to really be focused on not only implementing the consent decree, but thinking more broadly about culture change. So we need to rethink the test. We need to make sure that we are clear about what the job description is, and then we've got to do the selection criteria that fits with the objective and the mission of the new sergeant position. And then we've got to give them proper training and support, but also hold them accountable. So one of the things I'm very focused on is an early intervention system, which is still, unfortunately, in the pilot stages. but the sergeants are the ones that are really going to be on the front lines of making sure that those interventions happen, that they are effective, and if they're not, then we think about ways to manage people out of the department. So the sergeants, in my view, become critically important in changing the culture of the department.
Great. I'll pass it on to my colleague.
Sure.
Sure.
So another area that we asked about in the questionnaire was about the surveillance system across the city, and specifically we asked about specific steps that you would take in your administration to limit and regulate the use of cameras. In your response, you shared that this is a quote, "The extensive camera network is troubling because there is so little transparency surrounding it, and the system amounts to a surveillance state capable of capturing a person's daily routine." And you also said that the city must articulate a rationale for having such a large surveillance network, and if it cannot do so, the city should begin to winnow the number of cameras. So I suppose the first question sort of embedded in there is, what would be an adequate rationale for having such a large system? And you know, we know where it is now, but what in your mind would be the rationale?
Well, look, I was at OEMC when this ramp up started, and it was really driven by then Mayor Daley and thinking about London's system, where they've got CCTV literally everywhere, which has been helpful to them in dealing with terrorism incidents that have happened. So the idea, in theory, isn't a bad idea, but it's been done in such a willy-nilly way without a coherent strategy, as best I can tell. Now, we've got the city's cameras, we've got IDOT cameras, we've got private cameras, all feeding into the OEMC. I'm not sure what the rationale is, what the strategy is behind the kinds of cameras, the locations of those cameras. So it just felt like we're going to have all these cameras feed in without really thinking about the policy and privacy implications.
Right.
So what we need to do is really come up with a policy. The policy should drive the strategy, not the other way around. So I would like us to really kind of unwind the thought process and say, what's our objective here? How can we best serve the public in a protective way, but not violate people's rights? Now, the truth is, I was at OEMC in 2004. It's now 2019.
Right.
A lot has happened.
Yes.
And we've now got these things called smartphones that have cameras in them and are recording video on a regular basis. I see people walking down the street, Facebook Living themselves as if they're doing some, video travel journal. So the truth is, we're not going to go back from the extensive existence and use of cameras, but that doesn't mean we don't have a coherent policy. Now, I'd like to have that policy, the thought behind it, be informed by groups like the ACLU and other privacy protectors, so that we are striking the right balance. And then we need to also have a process by which, on a regular basis, the assumptions and bases for that policy are revisited, particularly in light of advancing technology.
Right.
So the bottom line is, we need to be much more intentional and thoughtful behind the policy, and I'm committed to making sure that happens.
Have you thought at all about what the timeline might look like to develop that policy, to figure out whether or not we could winnow cameras, whether or not there's a public discussion about the privacy policies? Have you thought at all about what that timeline looks like for you?
Beyond sooner rather than later?
Beyond sooner rather than later.
No, but I think it's something that we have to do. We're living in a very challenging world. We're taping this days after the horrible killings in Christchurch, New Zealand.
Right.
So those things matter. I'm mindful of the fact that summer's coming, and we need to make sure that we are doing everything that we can to fight violence. And I still have a big question in my mind of the mass shootings that happened last summer, where 70 people were shot, 12 people were murdered, most of which those shootings occurred outside, and yet there's one, maybe two people that have been arrested as a result of that. Cameras could have been an effective tool with those outside events where there clearly was no expectation of privacy. So we have all these cameras, but what are we doing with it? And how are we using it for the greater good? So I think we have to challenge some really core assumptions. Means it's intentional. I'm not sure how intentional it is, but we have to challenge some core notions about the use of cameras and make sure that they're actually being used for good in a way that does not trample on people's civil rights, but being thoughtful about it in a way that I don't know that we have been.
So the current mayor has blocked legislation that would prohibit suspending someone's driver's license for unpaid parking tickets, and most other non-moving violations. And so I wonder if, as mayor, you would see yourself as someone who could be willing to advocate for in Springfield for a change to that law so that, you know.
100%. People should not be going into bankruptcy over parking tickets. People should not be losing their driver's licenses on a basis of non-moving violations. And it's worse, what I'm hearing from people is not only those things are happening to them, but they're actually losing their vehicles. They're given, the fines are escalating, they're given such a short period of time in which to make up that money, and their cars are being sold either at auction or for scrap. That's a terrible thing. We cannot keep balancing the budget of the city on the backs of low-income and working-class people who are least able to handle it. And some of the data that I've seen has been really concerning, because it looks like there is a hugely disproportionate effect on Black and brown communities for these ticketing policies.
In terms of the ticketing policies themselves.
Absolutely right. So, look, we can change a lot of that at the city level, not have to wait for Springfield, but absolutely that will be part of a Springfield agenda for me if I'm fortunate enough to become the next mayor.
What happens when you become mayor, when you become mayor? What's the accountability mechanism that exists there?
Well, we are actually in the process of looking at the different policy prescriptions and promises, if you will, that we put out. And we'll publicize that. We'll give people an opportunity to measure whether or not we are making progress against those promises if I'm fortunate enough to become the next mayor. And I believe in total transparency.
And what would you suggest to the ACLU, our members, supporters, the activist community that we work with, where it's a year in, some of the things you've talked about still are not at the place where we'd want it to be? How can we hold you accountable?
Well, I think it's incumbent upon me, if I'm fortunate enough to become the next mayor, not only to put the list out and update it to show when progress is being made, but also to explain if we're stuck in a particular area or we're not making the kind of progress that we'd hope to make. There's got to be communication. It can't just be a one-time thing, here's the list, we're making progress, it's never updated. I believe that I have an obligation to make and give explanation in detail around the who and the what and the why, but also beyond that, to make sure that I am touching base with the various constituency groups that do play an important role in holding elected officials accountable, like the ACLU. I think we really have an opportunity in this election to fundamentally transform how government functions. And I invite your listeners and your supporters to go to our website or send us an email at info@lightfootforchicago.com. We are constantly soliciting feedback from people about things that they would like to see either focus on in the last 2 weeks of this election, but more to the point, to make sure that we are being responsive to the needs of the community. I say this all the time, and I really mean it. Government will work best when it is transparent, when it is responsive, and accountable. Those three things, I think, are critically important to really be able to be in a position to transform our government. And if I'm fortunate enough to become the next mayor, they're going to be the guiding light that we use in moving forward for a new day for Chicago.
Great. Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.